Banjo history time. Do you really need to know the history of the banjo in order to play it? Well, not really. Of course, you don't need to know it. But there's a lot caught up in the history of the banjo, and it will make you a little bit of a better person if you know some of it. Now, I'm not a scholar or a trained historian, but as a player over the past 20 years, I've read stuff, I've picked stuff up, and I've learned a lot. And this is a very brief crash course of what I know. The banjo is an instrument of the African diaspora. A number of banjo-like instruments can be found in Africa. One notable instrument is the akonting of Senegal and the Gambia, which has a short drone string, like today's banjos, and is played in a very similar way to what we now call the clawhammer banjo playing pattern. So rather than trying to find a single African ancestor to the North American banjo, many historians recognize that today's banjo is actually a synthesis of different instruments, born out of the ingenuity of different African peoples sharing culture while experiencing the trauma of slavery. The first banjos were made out of gourds, and I've got a gourd banjo that I built about 15 years ago, and it's pretty rough and ready. I even whittled these pegs myself, but it works. It does the trick, and even though it's not the most brilliant instrument, I'm glad I've got it. The banjo evolved over the course of 100 years, 200 years, until it became a main feature of the minstrel shows in the mid-1800s. Now, if you're not familiar, these shows featured white performers wearing black face makeup and performing comic songs in an exaggerated black dialect. Because of the obvious offensiveness, we don't like to talk about the minstrel shows much today. However, the minstrel shows were one of the most popular forms of entertainment in America during their time, a time which stretched for like 50 or 60 years. And the last vestiges of blackface performance remained well into the 20th century. So even though it is unpleasant and offensive, it is something that we have to reckon with as a huge element of the history of popular culture. And to complicate matters even further, many black performers, actual African American performers, had some of their first opportunities to perform in front of mixed audiences or white audiences because they performed minstrel material. And then some musicians and some composers tried to push the boundaries of what minstrel shows could be to be more truly representative of their own black experience. So it's definitely a mixed bag of history and well worth learning more about. It is almost exclusively because of the minstrel shows that the banjo became a popular American instrument. Builders in North America began producing banjos in the late 1800s, and they were picked up by players all across the English-speaking world and adapted to numerous musical styles. I have here a banjo from the turn of the century, so this banjo is about 120 years old, made by a maker called Wayman Banjos. And I've got it strung up with nylon strings. Originally, this banjo had violin-style tuners, friction tuners. As new musical styles like ragtime and jazz were being developed and finding commercial success, attention turned away from the old-time music that people played socially in their home communities. But in the 20s and 30s, when folklorists began to search for the old music, particularly in the southern Appalachian Mountains, they often intentionally ignored black players and trying to paint the picture of this old-time music as a holdout of America's pure Anglo-Saxon roots. And mixed with this whitewashing of the musical history was the hillbilly stereotype, which began to emerge. The stereotype of Appalachian folks as poor and rural and backward. This is a stereotype that Appalachian folks have been struggling under and fighting against for decades. So the banjo has two streams of appropriation that we need to reckon with. First, the white appropriation of the instrument from enslaved black musicians. And second is the appropriation from the rural South by performers from outside of these regions. One of the very small things that those of us who love the music can do is learn more. I also recommend that you listen to and support black musicians who are carrying on the black legacy of old-time music, and the Southern musicians who are carrying on their regional traditions. For those of you who actually want to learn how to play clawhammer banjo, stay tuned for the next installment.